بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Alhamdulillah, today inshallah we will be beginning lesson 4 of these classes on the road to perfecting our tajweed. Now last lesson we looked into detail in regards to the full mouth letters and the empty mouth letters. I'm just doing a quick recap on last lesson where we spoke about the full mouth letters and how they are known as the letters of isti'la. Can you remember that word? Isti'la. The full mouth letters kha, sad, dad, ta, va, ghain and qaf. Yeah, and if you want to remember in a one word, khussa daghtin qid. Okay, these letters are the huruful isti'la. Okay, so every time we read these letters, whether they have a fatha, damma, kasra, or if you like to call it zabar, zer, pesh, whenever these letters, these 7 letters have these signs, have these harakat, or you can call it vowel. Whenever these 7 letters have these vowels, then you'd read those letters full mouth. And all the remaining letters were empty mouth. And who can remember the term for it in Arabic? It was known as the letters of istifal. Okay, so isti'la is the full mouth letters and istifal is the empty mouth letters. And these are both opposing qualities. Opposing qualities. So if they're in one group, it's not going to be in the other group. Okay, and then we even looked at the rule of alif. We looked at the rule of alif. How we mentioned how alif, it's not in the full mouth letters and it's not in the empty mouth letters. Because alif is such a letter, if you remember, we spoke about the makhraj. We spoke about the place of exit for alif. Where alif, the place of exit is the emptiness of the mouth. Okay? And how do you determine the quality of alif, whether it's going to be full mouth or whether it's going to be empty mouth? You look at the letter before. Okay? And if you remember, alif is only pronounced when there's a fatha before. Okay? Alif is only pronounced when there's a fatha before it. And when there's a fatha before an alif, this is known as mad. This is known as mad. We're going to look into mad in detail going forward. So if there's a alif and the letter before is a full mouth letter, then the alif is also going to be full mouth. So in the example, kha fatha, and there's the alif, then you're going to read kha. So not only is the kha full mouth, the alif after will also be full mouth. Kha. And in the example of empty mouth, if there's alif and there's an empty mouth letter before it, then the alif will also be empty mouth. So for example, the example of za fatha and the alif after it, za. You understand? Za. So not only is the za empty mouth here, the alif is also empty mouth. So here we can see alif will be full mouth if the letter before is full mouth, and alif will be empty mouth, or I like to say smiley, if the letter before is also empty mouth. So that was the rule of alif. And then lastly we spoke about the rule of the lams in the name of Allah. The Allah's name has 2 lams, and generally everywhere else lam is always empty mouth. But when it comes to the name of Allah, okay, when it comes to the name of Allah, whenever you're reading Allah's name in the Quran, if there's a fatha or a dhamma before Allah's name, then you're going to read Allah's name strong. So for example, rafa'ahu Allahu, rafa'ahu Allahu. Here we see there's a hu, ha dhamma before Allah's name. So Allah, the lams will be strong. Rafa'ahu Allahu. And then in the example when there's a kasra before Allah's name is going to be empty. Bismillahi. Look how open my mouth becomes. Bismillahi. One is rafa'ahu Allahu and Bismillahi. Okay, you don't want to be saying Bismillahi. Wrong. Bismillahi. Nice and smiley. So this is what we covered in the previous lessons. Now today, inshallah, we're going to be covering one letter. And one letter only, and that is the letter Ra. Because we haven't covered this letter yet, have we? So in this lesson 4, we're going to be looking at all of the rules of Ra. Okay, we're going to be looking at the rules of Ra. Now, before we look at the rule of Ra, let's look at its quality. Let's look at its sifa. Okay, remember, Tajweed is reading every letter correctly. I want everyone to remember this, okay? What does Tajweed mean? Tajweed means to read every letter correctly with its makhraj and all of its qualities, all of its sifat. Okay, and here the letter of Ra, you can see nice and clearly on the board, the letter of Ra, it has a quality which is only found in this letter. And this quality, this sifa, is known as the sifa of takrir. The sifa, the quality of takrir. Okay, and takrir, it means like a slight repetition. Okay, and what does this quality create on this letter Ra? Let's just read the translation first. This quality will produce a shiver on the tongue. It will produce a shiver on the tongue. And the shiver should not be so excessive as to pronounce more than one Ra. So the shiver that will be on the tongue, it shouldn't be so much that it produces more than one Ra. Now, if you haven't understood that, then you'll understand it now. Now this letter Ra, we want to make sure we don't read this letter Ra like the English letter R. Okay, so for example, if I take a word in the Quran with the letter Ra, for example, Rijal, okay, Rijal. Now a very common mistake is if we read the letter Ra like an R, you'll end up saying Rijal. I've read it like the English letter, you know how QRS, the letter R when we say I'm running. Have you noticed when we read that letter, when we say the English letter R, so for example, running, my lips tend to curl in a bit, running. The bottom of my lips, they curl in, running. Do you understand? We want to make sure we don't read the Arabic letter Ra like this. So for example, if we do and we say Rijal, then we have not pronounced this quality of takrir. We have omitted this quality of takrir. And the way to bring this quality of takrir is by making a shiver on the tongue. Now, we don't want to do it. What does it mean by this shiver? And what does it mean by don't do the shiver too much? This shiver is basically rrr. That's what you call the shiver. Rrr. And if you do it too much, ra. If someone says rijal, okay, here I've made the shiver too much. And by doing it rijal, I've read more than one Ra. But what you need to do, you need to cut down that shiver as much as possible. So you don't want to read it like the English letter, Rijal, and you don't want to say it too much, Rijal. You want to say it, Rijal, just slightly, Rijal. If you listen very carefully, you can hear the shiver, but it's not too much that I'm reading more than two Ras. So listen very carefully, Rijal. Everyone try that, Rijal. And the way to make sure your Ra comes out properly is that your lips, they need to be open. If I'm reading it like the English letter, notice how, look at the shape of my lips. Rijal. That's wrong. I'm reading it wrong, by the way. I'm just doing it to show you. Rijal. I've read it like the English letter R. This is a big no-no. You don't want to do this. You want to make sure your mouth stays open. And the only thing that should be happening is your teeth, your tongue. If you remember, in the makhraj of Ra, the makhraj was that the immediate tip of the tongue is curled up and it touches the rijal, it touches the roots of the top teeth. And you want to just produce that slight shiver. Rijal. Rijal. Again, Rijal. Yeah? Just make sure you don't say Rijal or you don't say Rijal. Those two will be wrong. You want to be basically in the middle. Not Rijal or Rijal. Rijal. Again, everyone try with me. Rijal. So have you understood what it means by the producing a shiver on the tongue? Have you understood? What it means is that's what you call the shiver. But don't make the shiver too much. You don't want to make it too much, just slightly. Ri. Do you understand? So Rijal. Rijal. When we read this letter Ra with a fatha, we Ra fatha Ra. Again, everyone with me? Ra. Ra. Not too much. Don't do Ra. Just Ra. Ra. Ra with a dhamma. Ru. Again, Ru. Just imagine your tongue. You're producing that shiver, but to the minimum. Ru. And then Ra with a kasra. Ri. Ri. Okay, ri. You understand? Now this letter of ra. Okay, this letter of ra. All in the previous lessons we were looking at the full mouth letters and we were looking at the empty mouth letters. Now where does ra fall into it? Ra is basically actually in both the groups. And there are a lot of rules that we need to learn in regards to ra. It's very difficult, that's why I want to take this whole lesson to cover the rules of ra. Now all the other letters were very simple. All the other letters were very simple. For example, kha. Whether the kha has a shadda, whether it has a fatha, whether it has a dhamma, whether it has a kasra, whether it has a sukoon, kha will always be full mouth. You don't need to look at the letter before, you don't need to look at the letter after. It will always be full mouth. And let's look at an empty mouth letter, the letter za. Whether it has a fatha, dhamma, kasra, whether it has a sukoon, whether it has a shadda, za will always be empty mouth. Don't need to look at the letter before and we don't need to look at the letter after. Now the thing about ra, there are many things that you need to look at. There are many things that you need to look at, and here inshallah we're going to look at each scenario one by one. And the first case we're going to be looking at is ra mutaharrik. Ra mutaharrik. Now, who knows what mutaharrik means? Mutaharrik, does anyone know what mutaharrik means? Not full mouth. What did you say, uncle? A letter with a harakat. Mutaharrik is the Arabic term for a letter with a meaning mutaharrik literally means something moving. Okay, but in this case in Tajweed, it means a letter with a haraka. If you notice, look at the word haraka and mutaharrik. They both have the same letters, don't they? Mutaharrik, haraka. Yeah, mutaharrik, haraka. Haraka is basically zabar zair pesh, or you can call fatha dhamma kasra. Okay, it's always good to know both. Okay, fatha dhamma kasra or zabar zair pesh. And a letter with a fatha dhamma kasra will be known as mutaharrik. Okay, so here when you can see it's on your sheets and you can see it nice and clearly on the board. Ra mutaharrik basically refers to ra with a fatha, ra with a dhamma, and ra with a kasra. So ra mutaharrik refers to these three situations: ra with a fatha, ra with a kasra, and ra with a dhamma. Now what's the first case? When we have ra mutaharrik, okay, when ra has a fatha or a dhamma. So we're looking at the case of mutaharrik when the ra has a fatha or a dhamma. Then the ra will be read how? It's going to be read full mouth. Very simple. This rule is very simple. You don't need to look at the letter before or after. All we're going to look at is the sign. We're going to look at the haraka. We're going to look at the vowel on the ra. So when it's a fatha or a dhamma, the ra, remember, listen, and each time I'm reading this letter ra, I'm paying a lot of attention to making sure I'm not doing the shiva too much. So I want us all to keep this in mind as well, okay? We don't want to be reading like the English letter ra or ra. No, in the middle, ra, okay? Just that slight shiva, okay? So back to this first case of ra mutaharrik. When it's a fatha or a dhamma on the ra, then the ra will be read full mouth. Very simple. So let's look at the two examples. We have ra with a fatha in the word Rabbana. So I want everyone to read this with me. Rabbana. I want everyone to read after me. Okay, so again, Rabbana. Again, Rabbana. Notice very carefully how the ra I'm reading strong. I'm reading full. Rabb. But then the ba and the noon, how am I reading the ba and the noon? Empty mouth, because it's an empty mouth letter. And even the alif, how am I reading the alif after the noon? That's also empty mouth, because the noon is empty mouth. Exactly. So Rabbana. Notice how the ra I'm reading strong. I'm making sure my jaw is narrow. And the bana, I'm turning my mouth into a smile. Rabbana. Again, Rabbana. Bashar, I need your ra to be more strong. Right now you're reading your ra very smiley. Rabbana. Exactly. Again, Rabbana. Very simple rule. And the opposite, when ra has a kasra, then it will be read as empty mouth. It's going to be read with a smile. So the example, Rijal. And again, remember, really smile and say. We don't want to say rija, wrong. Smile. Rijal. Again, Rijal. Really smile your mouth and say it. Rijal. Exactly, one more time. Rijal. Exactly, so very simple, okay, very simple. When Ra has a Fatha or a Dhamma, it's going to be full. When it has a Kasra, it's going to be empty mouth. Very simple rule. And the next second case we have is Ra Mushaddad. What does Mushaddad mean? You can tell me. What does Mushaddad mean? A letter with a letter with a shadda. Do you understand? Mushaddad means a letter with a shadda. It just reminds me because Mushaddad sounds very similar to Mubashshar. And if you think about it, do you know what Mubashshar actually means? No. Mubashshar, it comes from the word Tabshir. Tabshir, Bashara, which means to give glad tidings. So Mubashshar actually means one of glad tidings, one of good news. That's what Mubashshar literally means. Okay, subhanallah, one of good news. So exactly, he always brings good news to us, mashallah, mashallah. This is going on YouTube, so everyone will mashallah. So mushaddad, a ra with a tashdeed, or you can call it a shadda. You can call it tashdeed, or you can call it shadda. Now, what is the rule of ra mushaddad? It's the same as ra mutaharrik, okay? You don't need to look at the letter before, you don't need to look at the letter after. When the ra is a mushaddad, you just look at the sign on top of the shadda. Because remember, when a letter has a shadda, it's also going to have something else. It's also going to have something else on top of the shadda. So, what are you going to say, uncle? Exactly, it's either going to have fatha, dhamma or kasra. So when there's a ra mushaddad and there's a let's say for example, let's look at the first one. When there's in the word harrama, ra mushaddad. Look at the sign on top of the shadda, which is a fatha. So then how is this ra going to be read? If there's a fatha on the shadda as well, we're going to look at the fatha, so it's going to be read full mouth. Do you understand? We're not going to look at the ha before and we're not going to look at the meme after. We're just going to look at the ra mushaddad. And we're going to read it. I want everyone to read it with me. And ra mushaddad, there's going to be a bit more of a shiver. Because why? How many Ra's are there when we look at Ra Mushaddad? How many Ra's? Two. So that shiva is going to be a bit more. But you don't want to make it too much. So it's going to be, listen very carefully first, it's going to be Harrama. Again, remember, you don't want to read it like the English letter. You don't want to say Harrama. If you say Harrama, there's no shiva there. And I've read the Ra like the English letter, which I don't want to do. I want to produce that shiva. Can you hear that? Harrama. So again, I want everyone to do one more time. Harrama. Again, harrama. One more time. Harrama. So this ra mushaddad is going to be full or empty? This one in this word? Full, because the ra mushaddad has the fatha. Okay, fatha. We're not going to look at the letter before or after. The ra mushaddad has a fatha, so it's going to be harrama. Nice and full. But remember, the ha and the meme, they need to be smiley. So harrama. The next one, we have the ra mushaddad and it has a dhamma. It has a dhamma. So then how is this ra going to be read? Full. So when you look at this, same again, because it's tashdeed, there's going to be a bit more of a shiva, but not too much. We don't want to say yamurr. Okay, we're not a car here. It's not yamurruna, it's yamurr. Control that shiva. That's what we need to do. We need to control that shiva. Yamurruna. Again, yamurruna. One more time. Yamurruna. Good. So this ra mushaddad, which also has the dhamma. So it's the ra mushaddad with the dhamma. How is this ra going to be read? Full mouth. So far the rules of ra mushaddad, they're exactly the same as ra mutaharrik. Okay, whether the mutaharrik and the mushaddad, if there's a fatha, ultimately, if there's a fatha dhamma on it, it's going to be full mouth. And if there's a kasra on it, it's going to be empty mouth. Now let's look at the next example. In the word sharri, okay, ra mushaddad, and the ra mushaddad, what sign, what haraka does it have? It has a kasra. We're not going to look at the sheen before. We're going to ignore the sheen before. We don't need to look at the sheen before. We're going to look at the ra mushaddad. It has a kasra, So we're going to read the ra mushaddad, empty mouth. So sharri, sharri. And very common mistake a lot of people do, they'll read sharri, sharri. What's wrong with me saying sharri? How have I read the ra? No, but sharri. I've read it like the English letter R, isn't it? You know the English letter R? I've read like the English letter R. Sharri, sharri. That's wrong. We want to make sure the difference between the English letter R and the Arabic letter Ra is that shiva. So sharri, again sharri, sharri, again sharri. And notice, am I smiling when I'm reading the Ra, or is my mouth narrow? I'm smiling, sharri. So this shows me Ra mushaddad, when it has a kasra, is it empty or full? Empty mouth. So far these first two rules, I really want everyone to understand these. Ra mutaharrik, fatha damma is full, kasra it's empty. And Ra mushaddad, you're going to look at the sign on top. If it's fatha damma, it's going to be full, and if it's kasra, it's going to be empty. So in these first two rules, has everyone understood them? Yeah? Anyone got any questions in these first two rules? No. Okay, now it's going to get a bit more tricky. It's going to get a bit more tricky now. Okay, now we have Ra Sakin. We have Ra Sakin. Okay, remember we looked at Ra Mutaharrik. Remember we looked at Ra Mushaddad. Now number 3, we are going to look at Ra Sakin. Okay, now what does Ra Sakin mean? That Ra with a Sukoon. That Ra with a Sukoon. And if you remember, Sukoon is basically, the best way I can explain it, it's like a full stop on the letter. So for example, when I mentioned last lesson, I think it was, when I say my name Sadiq, that qaf, diq, I've read the qaf with a sukoon. It's like that. My voice is coming to an end on the qaf. So that qaf has a sukoon. When I say Uncle Akram's name, Akram, that qaf has a sukoon because I've stopped, meaning my sound, my voice stops on that letter, Akram. Even the meme has a sukoon. Okay? Do you understand? So that's what sukoon means. Now here we are looking at the rules when the ra has a sukoon. So ra sakin. Now when ra has a sukoon, what do? You look at the letter before. Now you start looking around, okay? Now you start looking around. You look at the letter before. Remember, if it was a kha with a sukoon, let's take the example of kha with a sukoon. Do we need to look at the letter before? No. Kha sakin will always be what? Full mouth. Za sakin will always be what? Empty mouth. But ra sakin, what do you need to do? You need to look at the letter before. And basically, what I mean by you need to look at the letter before, you need to look at the mutaharrik before, the letter with the haraka before. Now, once we look at the letter with the haraka before, if the mutaharrik, if the letter before has a fatha or damma, then the ra will be full mouth. Very simple. The ra will be full mouth. And we'll understand from the examples. Here I've got the first example. Arsala. We have the hamza. Remember, it's a hamza, okay? Not alif, it's a hamza. So we have the hamza with a fatha and the ra which has a sukoon. So then how is the ra going to be read? Full mouth. Okay? We don't need to look at, when we're looking at the hamza, we're not going to say, hamza is an empty mouth letter. We're not going to look at that. We're going to look at the sign. We're going to look at the sign on the hamza. We're not going to look at the letter hamza. We're going to look at the sign on the hamza. So we're actually not looking at the letter. We're looking at the sign. We're looking at the haraka before the ra. Okay? So when the haraka before the ra is a fatha or a damma, it's going to be full mouth. So in the example, arsala, I want everyone to read after me. So arsala. Notice how full the ra sounds. Arsala. One more time. Remember the hamza, you need to make sure it's smiley. So you start out smiling and then you make it full. Arsala. Again, make sure you don't say or. If you say or, then you made the hamza full mouth as well, which is wrong. So ar. So again, arsala. One more time. Arsala. Exactly. Let's look at the next example. Ra sakin. And in this case, the ta has a damma. So tur, nice and strong. Turja'una. Again, turja'una. Again, turja'una. So very simple, okay? Ra sakin, look at the sign before. Look at the haraka before. If it's a dhamma or a fatha, then the ra will be full mouth. And let's look at B. If the haraka before or the mutaharrik before has a kasra, just understand this for now, okay? If the haraka before has a kasra, then it will be read empty mouth. Now let's look at the example. It will be read empty mouth. So for example, we have this word shawirhum. The waw has a kasra. Yet we have the ra sakin, and before it we have the letter waw with a kasra. So just generally looking at this word as a whole, we have a ra sakin and the letter before kasra. How will we read this ra? Empty mouth. So we're not going to say shawir. Shawir. Nice and smiley. Shawirhum. Do you understand? It's very important that we produce that shiva on the tongue. Remember, not too much, but slight shiva. So we don't want to say shawir. Shawirhum. Again, shawirhum. Okay, so we've understood so far, because this is going to get more confusing. What I want you to understand for now is that when the ra sakin, there's a fatha or dhamma before, then it's going to be full mouth always, okay? Always, we don't need to look at anything else. And when there's a kasra before it, it's going to be empty mouth, but, and there's a big but. There are 3 conditions that need to be met in regards to the kasra. Okay, this is only for the case for B. These 3 conditions we are going to go through, this is only for B, not for A. Okay, A is very simple. Ra sakin, fatha or dhamma before it, always going to be full. Ra sakin, kasra before it, generally will be empty, as long as the 3 conditions are met. Now, what are those 3 conditions? I want us all to go through them nice and slowly. If anyone doesn't understand anything, please let me know, inshallah, and I'll repeat it and I'll try to explain it as much as I can, okay? Now, what are the 3 conditions? They're on the board and they're on your paper. The first condition, we'll understand it bit by bit, okay? The first condition is that kasra before the ra is permanent. That kasra before the ra is permanent, okay? Otherwise, if the kasra is not permanent, if it's a temporary kasra, then the ra sakin will not be read empty mouth, it will be read full mouth. So the kasra before the ra sakin has to be permanent. If it's a temporary kasra, then the ra sakin will be read full mouth. And where do you get temporary kasras? Generally, temporary kasras are found on alifs, okay? They are found on alifs which come at the beginning of the verse. So for example, if you look at Suratul Fajr, I'm not sure if anyone knows Suratul Fajr here, but right at the end, the ayat come down to Ya ayyatuhan nafsul mutma'innah. And then the next verse is irji'i. Okay, irji'i. That word irji'i, it should be on your papers and you can see it on the board as well. Irji'i, that alif, that's an alif, okay? That's an alif. It's not a hamza. It's an alif. And this alif we are reading with a kasra. Listen to me very carefully. I'm reading it with a kasra, aren't I? But is this kasra permanent or temporary? Temporary. Now, what makes it temporary? Who can tell me what makes it temporary?
It is to link the...
Meaning it basically, what it means by temporary is we are giving this alif a kasra because we have stopped on the previous ayah. If I connect the ayah before, if I link the ayah before to this one, listen to how it sounds. Ya ayyatuhan nafsul mutma'innatur ji'i. What's happened to the alif? Am I reading or has it gone? It's gone. I'm not reading it anymore because this is an alif. This isn't a hamza. Okay? This is alif are usually silent. Yeah, and this is known as Hamzatul Wasl. Yes, it's known as Hamzatul Wasl, but it's basically an alif. Okay, so when we join the two ayah together, Ya ayyatuhan nafsul mutma'inna turji'i. But if I run out of breath, yeah, if I run out of breath, which I usually do, and I stop on it, and I say Ya ayyatuhan nafsul mutma'inna, and now I want to start from this word. Irji'i. Okay, the rule is, this is a verb, by the way. This is a verb. And what are you going to read on the alif? You're going to read a kasra on the alif. Why? Because the closest sign, the third letter jim, has a kasra. The rule is, when the third letter has a fatha or a kasra, then you'll read the alif with a kasra. Do you understand? So this alif, we're going to read it with a kasra. And now let me ask you again, is this kasra on the alif permanent or temporary? It's temporary. So now that we know that this kasra is temporary, this ra sakin, are we going to read it full mouth or empty mouth? Full mouth. Because remember, the rule is that if there's a kasra before ra sakin, you read the ra sakin full mouth with the condition that the kasra is permanent. Remember, if you look at the first condition on your sheet and on the board, the first condition is the kasra before the ra is permanent. Here we've established that the kasra is what? It's temporary. The kasra isn't permanent, it's temporary. So then how are we going to read this ra? Full mouth. So we're not going to say ir, we're going to say ir. Notice, I'm not saying irji'i, I'm going to say ir. I'm reading it. This rule, it goes against the qaida. Yeah. Normally we've been learning ra sakin, kasra before empty mouth, but not in this case. Why? Because the kasra is temporary. So we are not going to say irji'i. We're going to say, I want everyone to read after me. Irji'i. Again. Irji'i. One more time. Irji'i. And even if we join the two ayah together, Ya ayyatuhan nafsul mutma'inna turji'i, how is the ra going to be there? Tur. It's still going to be full mouth. Because there's a dhamma before it now. There's a dhamma before it, so it's still going to be full mouth. If there was a kasra before it, if that tu had the kasra, then it will be empty mouth. You understand? Okay? Sorry. Scratch that. Because we're going to look at the next condition. When we look at the next condition, you will understand. Okay, but the first condition was what? The first condition was the kasra needs to be permanent. It needs to be permanent. If it's temporary, then the ra sakin will be full mouth. The second condition is the kasra and the ra sakin are in the same word. Okay, so I never looked at the second example of the first condition. The second example was irhamhuma. Irhamhuma. Same again. We have a ra sakin and there's a alif with a temporary kasra, so it's also going to be full mouth. So I want everyone to read it after me. Irhamhuma. One more time. Irhamhuma. So see, in the first condition, the kasra before the ra needs to be permanent. The second condition for the ra sakin to be empty is the kasra and the ra sakin, they need to be in the same word. They need to be in one word, same word, okay? So when we look at the B, can you see right at the top, B? Shawirhum. Shawirhum. First of all, that waw with the kasra. Is this waw permanent? Is the kasra permanent or temporary in the waw? Permanent. So we've met the first condition, yeah? The second condition, the kasra and the ra should be in one word. Shawirhum. Is that one word or two words? It's one word. It's one big word, okay? Shawirhum is one word. So the second condition is also met. If they're not in the same word, if the kasra is in the word before and the ra is in the next word, then the ra will be read full mouth. So when you look at the examples, we have and then you have irtab, okay? We have and when you join it, the meme, we're going to read with a kasra. Now generally, according to the normal rule, when there's a kasra meme before ra sakin, generally the ra will be what? empty. Generally it will be empty. But here, the ra sakin is in this word and the kasra is in the previous word. So when the kasra and the ra sakin are in separate words, then the ra sakin will also be read full mouth. So we're not going to say amir, we're going to say amir, amir. I want everyone to say with me, after me, amir tabu. Amir tabu. Good, one more time. Amir tabu. Amir tabu. The ta needs to be smiley. So don't say ta. Amir tabu. Amir tabu. Exactly. The next one, we have the rab, we have the ba with the kasra, and we have the ra with the sukoon. But is the ra and the kasra in the same word or different words? Different. So the ra here is also going to be full mouth. So we're not going to say rabbir, rabbir, rabbir ji'un. Again, rabbir ji'un. Again, one more time. Rabbir ji'un. You understand? So this is the second condition. The second condition for ra sakin to be empty, the kasra and the ra sakin need to be in one word. If they're in two words, then the ra sakin will be full mouth. Okay? As you can see in the word shawirhum, the kasra and the ra sakin are in one word, aren't they? They're in one word. And what's the third condition? Third condition. So the first condition, kasra needs to be permanent. Second condition, kasra needs to be in the same word. And the third condition is, here all this time we were looking at what's before the ra sakin. Now we are going to look at what's after the ra sakin. Okay? And the third condition is that the huruful isti'la do not appear after the ra sakin. Now what was the huruful isti'la? They are also known as the full mouth letters. Kha, khussa, daghtin, qid. These are the full mouth letters, the huruful isti'la. Okay, so let's look at the word shawirhum. Okay, let's look at the word shawirhum. After the wir, what's the next letter? Ha. Ha. Is ha a full mouth letter? It's an empty mouth letter. So here, all three conditions are met in this word shawirhum. All three conditions are met. That's why the ra is going to be empty mouth. But if a full mouth letter, if a huruful isti'la appears after ra sakin, then how will the ra sakin be read? Full mouth. So we'll understand by the example. Look at this example here. We have mir. When we just look at the word mir, we have mim kasra, and the kasra is permanent, yes? Yeah. And we have the next letter ra sakin. Is the kasra and the ra sakin in the same word? Yeah. The kasra and the ra sakin, are they together? Are they in the same word? Yeah. So far, this condition is met. The first condition is met. The second condition is met. But let's see, is the third condition met? Is there a huruful isti'la after the ra sakin? Yes, there's a letter sad. So now because this condition isn't met, remember all three conditions need to be met. All three conditions, they need to be found. If any one of them is missing, then the ra sakin will be read full mouth. So when you look at this example, we have mir, but then there's a sad after it. So we're not going to say mir anymore, we're going to say mir, mir, sada. Again, mir, sada. Again, mir, sada. And tell me again, what makes this ra sakin full? What has made this ra sakin full? The letter of isti'la after it. Very simple. Because of this letter sad, which has come after the ra sakin, the ra will also be now full mouth. Let's look at the next example. Qir. We have qaf, kasra, qir. Remember, we don't need to look at the letter before anymore. We have qir. Qaf has a kasra, ra sakin. So far it should be empty. But what's the next letter? Ta. Ta is a letter of isti'la, a letter of full mouth. So now how is this ra going to be read? Full or empty? Full. So qir. We're not going to say qir anymore. We're going to say qir. Tas. Again, qir. Tas. So can you see in both of these cases, because of the harful isti'la, after the ra sakin, the ra is now full mouth. And the third example we've got, so here, Fir. We have fa kasra, fi, ra sakin, fir. Okay. The first condition is met. Kasra is permanent. Second condition is met. Kasra and ra sakin in the same word. But the third condition is not met. What's the letter after the what's the letter after the ra sakin? Qaf. So we're not going to say fir. We're going to say firqah. Again, the ra full. Firqah. Again, firqah. Now, so this is the third condition. However, there's one exception, okay? There's one exception, and this exception is up to you, however you want to read it. And this exception is the word firqin. Firqin. Here, let's look at it, okay? Firqin. We have the kasra before the ra, and it's in the same word, but there's a qaf after it. Qaf. Huruful isti'la. Even then, you can still read an empty mouth. Can anyone tell me why? Firqin. Can anyone tell me why? Because technically, according to this third condition, the qaf should make the ra full as well. But then why is it still empty? If you notice in this one, mirsada, the sad had a fatha, mirsada, qirtasun, the ta had a fatha, qirtasun, firqa, qaf had a fatha. But in this word, firqin, what does the qaf have here? Kasra. And that qaf, because of that qaf has a kasra, this gives you the opportunity to read the ra empty as well. Do you understand? You can read it firqin, but me personally, I find it easier because this word, it comes in the Quran. I find it easier to read the ra smiley, to read the ra empty mouth. Firqin. Firqin. It's more easier. Firqin. You understand? So this is the only exception where you can read it both ways. So this was the rules of ra sakin, okay? So a quick brief recap. Ra sakin, what do? You look at the sign before. If it's a fatha or a dhamma, full mouth. If it's a kasra, empty mouth, as long as the kasra is permanent, as long as the kasra is in the same word, and as long as the letter after the ra sakin is not huruful isti'la. If it's any of these three, even if it's one, then the ra sakin will also become full. Do you understand? So ra sakin, when there's a kasra before it, the kasra needs to be permanent, the kasra needs to be in the same word, and there shouldn't be a huruful isti'la after it. Has everyone understood the third state of ra sakin? Okay, if anyone hasn't understood, inshallah, you can ask me later, inshallah. Is that okay? Now this was the third case, ra sakin. And the last case we have is ra mawqufa. Ra mawqufa. And what does mawqufa mean? Mawqufa basically means that letter upon you are doing waqf. And who remembers what does waqf mean? Waqf means stopping. Okay, that ra, it's not on there? No? No. Allah Akbar. I forgot to write these ones down. Inshallah, I'll give you all new sheets with these ones added, okay? Is that okay, inshallah? So here we have ra, or what we'll do, inshallah, we'll do this next lesson. Okay, and I'll give you the handouts, inshallah, next lesson. It's 9 o'clock as well. But everything that we've covered so far, inshallah, please, try to digest it. And there's a few examples as well that I'd like you to practice, inshallah. So for example, if you look at the first example, okay, just let's look at the first example. These are all examples from the Quran, by the way. So la ta'kulur riba. How is this ra being read? Full or empty? Why is that full, uncle? So it's got a kasra, the ra has a kasra, so it's going to be what? Empty mouth. Remember, ra, if when we look at this example, this is basically the rule 2. When you look back on the front of the sheet, rule 2, you have ra mushaddad. The rule of ra mushaddad is the same as ra mutaharrik. So this ra mushaddad, it has a kasra, so it's going to be empty mouth. La ta'kulur riba, not riba, la ta'kulur riba. I want everyone to read it after me. La ta'kulur riba. Exactly, remember empty mouth, and make sure you don't say riba. What's wrong with saying riba? You've made the ba full mouth, it should be empty. So again, everyone after me. La ta'kulur riba. Riba, good. Next one, and let's just look at the next example as well. We have the word maghfirah. Ra fatha, how is the ra going to be? Full or empty? Full mouth. And in the word mir rabbihim, the rash mushaddad is going to be full or empty? Full mouth, because the ra mushaddad has a fatha. So I want everyone to read it after me. Maghfiratum mir rabbihim. And again, maghfiratum mir rabbihim. So I want everyone to practice these. The thing is, some of these examples are actually the examples of ra mawqufa. Okay, some of these examples are examples of ra mawqufa. So if you haven't understood them, inshallah, we'll go over them next lesson. Okay, I do apologize that I didn't actually fit this one on the sheet. I did forget, but I'll fit it on the next one. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us good understanding of these rules and give us the ability to implement them, inshallah. Ameen. Does anyone have any questions before we finish? No? Alhamdulillah, subhanallah wa bihamdi, subhanaka Allahumma bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.